Hi, Nutrition 101. Welcome to Chapter 5, Lipids, Fats, Phospholipids, and Sterols. Today we're going to be talking about fat types or lipid types, as well as fatty acid types. And then next we'll dive into digestion, absorption, metabolism, talk a little bit about heart disease and cardiovascular disease, as well as the recommendations for fat. So this is going to be part 1 of a 4-series lecture. So if we want to think about this, which foods in your diet provide fat? Why do you need fat in your diet? And what are the benefits and consequences of a low-fat diet? Be prepared to answer these questions when we come to class next time or on a discussion board on Moodle. If we look at the sources of dietary fats in the human diet, we have some animal sources of fats, which include meat, cheese, and dairy. We have some plant sources of fat, which include vegetable oils, nuts, and things like avocados, which is a fatty fruit. We put it in the vegetable group, though. And then we have hidden fat. So hidden fat is fat that's been pre-added to foods. That might include things like French fries, pizza, some pasta dishes, especially those delicious creamy ones like fettuccine alfredo, baked goods, and also salad dressings. So if we're looking at the benefits of dietary fats, they provide a texture, flavor, and aroma for foods that we don't see in any other nutrient, and that's because fat floats. When you think about something like M&Ms, they melt in your mouth, not in your hands, right? So the candy coating on the outside is water soluble, but then that chocolate is fat soluble, so that melting property or creamy property is what you see in fat that you don't see in other foods. That's why a fat-free muffin doesn't necessarily taste the same as a full-fat muffin, or egg whites don't necessarily have the same texture as full-fat eggs. Or, turkey bacon, it doesn't taste quite as delicious as regular bacon does due to its lack of fat content. So if we look at this graph right here, we can see that the fat grams per day in men and women hasn't really changed much from 1971 to today. It's recommended that we get between 20 and 35% of fat from our diet. That's the AMDR. And if we take a look over here on the right, you can see that the fat intake as percentage of total calories has really decreased in both men and women from 1971 to today. So it's gone down from about 37 or 36% of fat as total calories to around 32 to 33% of fat as total calories. And the real reason for that is because our calorie intake has gone up, right? So since our calorie intake has gone up 3 or 4%, over the last 40 years or so, we now see that fat as a percentage of total calories has gone down. So it's not necessarily that we've taken fat out of our diet, it's that we've added more refined carbohydrates to our diet and more empty calories from other nutrients. And so fat just is a lower percentage of our total intake. This is one of the reasons that the low-fat diets of the 90s didn't necessarily work. We just started replacing fat with sugar in the diet, and that ended up leading to, all sorts of health consequences and our obesity epidemic that we see today. If we look at lipids and think about the different types of lipids that are in our diet, there are 3 major types of lipids: triglycerides, phospholipids, and sterols. Lipids are also called fat in the diet, and that's what you're going to see on the nutrition facts label. Triglycerides are made up of 3 fatty acids and 1 glycerol, and when we talk about fat in food, we tend to talk about their fatty acid types, even though we tend to eat the fats as a triglyceride. Phospholipids are found in cell membranes, and they also act as emulsifiers in foods. They can be starting material for other products as well, such as ATP or something like that. Sterols include cholesterol, and then plants also have sterols that have some health benefits. Cholesterol is a little bit controversial. Too much of it could possibly lead to cardiovascular disease, but it's not quite as bad as we used to think it was, which is why eggs are so controversial. Should you have one a day or one a week? We'll talk about that a little bit more as we move on to the other lectures. Cholesterol is also found in cell membranes and can act as starting materials for other products. So let's take a look at each of these. So you can see the triglycerides are a glycerol backbone connected to 3 long carbon chains called fatty acids. Over on the right here is the omega end, that's the very end that's free floating. And over by the glycerol end is called the carboxyl end, and that's where the carbon chain connects to the glycerol backbone. Phospholipids are a little bit different. They have a hydrophobic tail, so a fat-soluble tail, and a hydrophilic head, or water-soluble head. So you see the head has a phosphate group, the tail is a fatty acid group, so the tail is attracted to fatty products, and the head is attracted to water-soluble products. Our cell membranes are made of phospholipids, and that enables the aqueous environment inside and outside the cell to remain semi-permeable, so some products can cross that cell membrane when certain enzymes are present, when certain hormones attach, and when osmosis occurs, going from higher to lower concentration. Another lipid type is the sterol, and so this is a picture of cholesterol. Sterols are much different shape. They're multiple chemical rings, and sterols have some different properties. They can be starting material for things like hormones. So our sex hormones like estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone are made of sterols, as well as vitamin D, which is actually a hormone in our blood. As you can see here, cholesterol in the diet is only found in animal products. So 2 large eggs and you go over your cholesterol intake for the day, it's recommended that we get less than or equal to 300 milligrams per day. We also have cholesterol in other animal products such as beef, chicken, and fish, even though it's a little bit less than the eggs, and also in some dairy products as well. Cholesterol is not an essential nutrient, so you can see if somebody was vegetarian or vegan, they wouldn't have any cholesterol in their diet. That doesn't necessarily mean they'll be deficient, as long as they're getting enough fat overall in their diet. Let's talk a little bit about the properties of fats in terms of fatty acids and carbon bonding. Carbon is an atom that can bind to 4 different other atoms, so it has 4 spots where it can bind. When we look at carbon bonds, you can either bind to 4 individual other atoms, or you can form a double bond. This is how we describe saturated versus unsaturated fats, depending on what types of bonds are between the carbon molecules. Saturated fats are saturated with hydrogens, so the carbons are all saturated with hydrogens. That means that each one has an individual connection or single bond to each of the additional carbon or hydrogen atoms. On the other hand, things like vegetable oils are unsaturated, which means that there's at least 1 double bond, which would be called monounsaturated fat, or more than 1 double bond, which could be called a polyunsaturated fat. Those double bonds allow the fatty acids to bend and move a little bit more, and so they end up having a little bit more liquid or fluid form at room temperature. We also have essential and non-essential fatty acids. Essential fatty acids can't be made in the body, so they're essential in the diet. An example are some omega-3 fatty acids are needed in the diet. So DHA and EPA are needed to be taken into the diet, or else other omega-3 fatty acids that can turn into EPA and DHA. So an example of a place you could find EPA and DHA would be in fish, or you can find the precursor to that in something like walnuts or flaxseed. Non-essential fatty acids can be made by the body, so they're not essential in the diet, and some omega-6 and omega-9 fatty acids are non-essential. Other omega-6 fatty acids are essential, so we can say omega-6s and omega-3s are 2 essential fatty acids. And then we have cis versus trans fatty acids. So in nature, we tend to have the hydrogens on a double bond on the same side of the carbon molecule. So this is typically how it happens in nature, and that gives the fluid nature of an unsaturated fat. On the other hand, a trans fatty acid causes those hydrogens to switch sides and be on the opposite side of the carbon bond on that double bond, which causes the trans fatty acid to look a little bit more like a saturated fat if you're looking at it at room temperature. An example of this would be Crisco oil or anything that contains hydrogenated oil. Manufacturers use the hydrogenation process or partial hydrogenation process to create a more stable product, so a cheaper product that lasts on the shelf a longer time. So that's why something like Twinkies, even though they're full of, vegetable oil, don't go bad because that vegetable oil has been hydrogenated, and so they have a really long shelf life. So as you can see here, our types of fatty acids include saturated, which means there's no double bonds, and unsaturated, which means there's one or more double bonds. Under unsaturated fat, we have polyunsaturated fat. Naturally occurring ones are usually in the cis form, or the hydrogens on the same side of the double bond, or sometimes when we go through processing, they're in the trans form, or on the opposite side of the double bond, which causes them to be more solid at room temperature. Then we have our omega-3s and our omega-6s, which we consider our essential fatty acids. And then we have the monounsaturated fats, which just have one double bond, which have a lot of good health properties as well. So if we were looking at this, thinking about, what are the similarities and differences between saturated and unsaturated fat, mono and polyunsaturated fat, omega-3 and omega-6 fats, and cis and trans fats, we should be able to come up with 2 to 3 differences between all of those different things. So be prepared during lecture to go through this and talk a little bit about what those similarities and differences are. Looking at this little chart here, you can see that we have an example of a fully saturated fat, a polyunsaturated fat, and a monounsaturated fat. And both the poly and monounsaturated fat are considered omega-3 fatty acids. So you see on the left side, that would be considered the carboxyl side, and the right side of each of these fatty acids is going to be considered the omega side. If we count 3 carbons from the omega side, you can see on numbers 1 and 2 that that third carbon is where the first double bond occurs. So that makes it an omega-3 unsaturated fats. It's the third carbon from the omega end where the first double bond occurs. On the other hand, the bottom one, number 3, is a saturated fat because there are no double bonds on there. When we look at number 1, that would be considered a monounsaturated fat because there's only one double bond, and number 2 would be considered a polyunsaturated fat because there are 2 double bonds, and 2 or more equals polyunsaturated. Now let's just finish up by talking about the sources here. So if we look at the saturated fats are found mostly in animal fats, as well as in tropical oils. So something like coconut oil or palm kernel oil are both solid at room temperature as well, and they're high in saturated fat. If we look at unsaturated fat, we have the polyunsaturated fats. The trans fats are mostly going to be found in baked goods and processed foods. Our omega-3s, which we tend to not get enough of in the diet, are found in cold water fatty fish like salmon, mackerel, and tuna, as well as flaxseed and walnuts. Omega-6 fatty acids are found in most vegetable oils and most nuts, and monounsaturated fats are found in canola oil, olive oil, and peanuts, which peanuts are a legume, not a tree nut, so they have a little bit different fatty acid content. So if you were to think about which is the healthiest versus to least healthy, you'd want to go first for the polyunsaturated omega-3 fats. So that would include your fish, your walnuts, and your flaxseed. Then monounsaturated fats also have some great health benefits. We'd want to go for olive oil and canola oil. Omega-6 fats, would be next on the list. You can think about nuts and seeds. Saturated fats are animal products, And then the trans fats are what we want to avoid at all costs. So tune in next time to get a little bit more on digestion and absorption of our fats and oils.